In this video, we're going to take a look at some art and design examples, as well as some design vocab terms for the Poetic Imagery Assignment in Illustrator. So all of these are going to fall under this umbrella of talking about graphic style. And this is simply the choices made when creating a two-dimensional image. We could break down graphic style into a few different components. These include the degree of stylization or abstraction versus a maybe more natural or sort of realistic looking image. We could also look at the color palette, which is just the choices of colors used and how they combine with one another, as well as the projection system. And we'll show some examples of different projection systems in later slides. But first, let's talk about graphic style a little bit more broadly. In this example from David Maticelli, where one character in the image is rendered in sort of a pink crosshatch, another character is rendered in this sort of really geometric, almost empty, really formal style. And that is something the illustrator is choosing to do to help highlight the differences between these two characters. So we can see that here, heterogeneous or consonant graphic style. And that is where multiple different graphic styles are used in the same image. You can see another example of that here. So you could think about maybe this approach being useful if you're referencing a poem that has maybe some sort of a contradiction in it or some sort of a conflict between different characters. Okay, so we've talked a little bit more broad strokes about graphic style. Let's start to break down some of the different components that we mentioned at the beginning of the slideshow. So one really important one is the point of view or the vantage point. One way to think about point of view is it is the fictional place where the viewer is standing when they're looking at a composition. Now, a lot of compositions will just have one vantage point. This is a really interesting example from Marianne where we have multiple mixed points of view or multiple mixed vantage points. This can kind of give us a feeling of this character moving through time. So we can see it sort of looks to be the same character just based on sort of the facial features and the hair in different positions, and we're seeing sort of different crops of that character. So this gives us sort of an experience of looking at multiple things that this character is doing all at the same time. So kind of compressing time together in a really interesting way. Now we could also look at an illustrator like Natalia Vico. In this example, our point of view is very, very close to the subject. So that's kind of giving us this feeling of kind of tightness, intimacy, like we are right next to this person's face, very close up. So point of view or vantage point is something really powerful that you can use to manipulate the way that it feels to look at or experience an image. Now we could also look at color palette, and we have lots of different ways to talk about color palette. We can talk about some basics such as hue or saturation or brightness. We can talk about the ways that the colors relate to one another. So one way to do that is to talk about an analogous color palette, and that's where colors are located near one another on the color wheel. So we can see this example here from Illustrator Shawna X, where the colors we're using are in some ways very similar, right? They're all very warmish tones. We're really not getting any greens or blues. Kind of the closest we come is a little bit of purple or magenta. So in some ways that helps this image feel very unified. And the fact that we are sort of mixing these different points of view together doesn't feel quite as jarring as it could be if we had different color palettes sort of contrasting with each other. And we could also look at some more variations on these specific types of color palettes. We could look at a triadic complementary or a triad, and that's where colors that are equally spaced around the color wheel. Like we can see in some parts of this image where we have a yellow, a blue, and a red. So those are triadic colors. Now, of course, it's pretty rare for an artist's image or a designer's image to just contain the specific color palette, that's mentioned in the vocab. That's okay. There's lots of different ways to talk about it. We could also sort of get even more specific into terms where we talk about tetradic or double complementary, where we use two sets of complementary colors, which is really actually what's going on in these images here. Now, on the other hand, we don't necessarily have to be so technical with saying here's exactly the type of color palette that the artist is using. These vocab terms can kind of give us touch points, though, for talking about it, engaging in critique with it, etc. Now let's move on from color palette and talk about projection systems. So here we're talking about the way that the artist is creating depth or space in an image. Now, one projection system that you're probably pretty familiar with is linear perspective, and you can see that here in the example from artist Teddy Kang. So with linear perspective, the relative size and shape and position of objects are determined by lines that converge at a point on the horizon. And we could imagine that point here being the end point of the lines of this grocery store aisle sort of converging at the end of the aisle. And what's going to happen with linear perspective is that parts of the image that are closer to the image plane are going to look larger. Parts of the image that are closer to the point of convergence, also called the vanishing point, are going to be smaller. And we can see that happening exactly here, where the items on the shelves, for example, closer to the image plane are larger. As we get closer to the vanishing point, which is the center of the image, the items are going to get smaller. So that's a very familiar way of dealing with space in a two-dimensional image. We know it from the way that our vision works, as well as photographs. The cool thing is there's lots of other options for how to represent space on a two-dimensional plane. One example of that is axonometric projection. This is a technique that is often used in technical drawings, since we don't get the same distortion that we would get with linear perspective, where some things are smaller, some things are larger, depending on where they are in the sort of imaginary space. So here we get some parts of the image that are always going to be drawn to scale. So horizontal and vertical lines, like we would see on the sides and the top of the building, these are always going to be proportional to each other. And again, that contrasts with linear perspective, where these lines would be sort of converging as we get closer to the back of the house. We could also look at a similar way of using a projection system called orthographic projection. So this is a single view of an object, such as a view from the front of a building or a person, just kind of flattened onto the drawing surface. So you can see here, this is very flat. We really don't get that sort of linear perspective recession that sort of makes it look like we're going back into space. This looks very flat. All of these are different ways that you can use to manipulate the way your image works and the way it looks. And you can use that to help you highlight parts of the poem or the interpretation of the poem that you're interested in focusing on in your work. Now, last but not least, let's take a look at reverse perspective. This is a really weird one, but I always love how sort of jarring these images look. This projection system is similar to linear perspective, but the convergence point is at the front of the image plane rather than the back. So you can see as things get closer to the front of the image plane, they're getting smaller, right? So take, for example, the bed frame here. As the end of the bed gets closer to us, the viewer, it's smaller. As it moves away into the background, it gets larger. So making a simple switch like this in terms of just where the convergence point is can really have a big impact in terms of how an image feels. These seem like very logical, kind of mundane images, but that reverse perspective just makes them feel so disorienting and like something's really wrong. So again, you could think of making connections between what's going on in your poem, maybe the feeling of the poem or the experience of reading the poem, and what just the space that you're rendering looks like.